It was a quiet afternoon in Raleigh, North Carolina. The sky held a soft overcast, the kind that hinted at rain, but never quite delivered. In a modest neighborhood, children's laughter echoed faintly from a nearby park. Neighbors exchanged pleasantries while trimming hedges or washing cars, the hum of suburbia carrying on as usual. But for one woman, this day, January 23rd, would shatter the fragile calm she had worked so hard to rebuild. Roner, standing by her kitchen window, wiped her hands on a dish towel. The scent of fresh bread filled the small house, a symbol of how far she had come in just 2 years. For most of her life, she'd lived in survival mode. Now, with John Rowe by her side, she had finally begun to feel safe. John, a retired family doctor in his early 60s, had entered Roner's life at a time when she had all but given up on the idea of love. He wasn't flashy or overly romantic. What he offered was far more valuable stability, patience, and the kind of respect that felt foreign after years of enduring a marriage that had left her emotionally scarred. Rodriguez, her ex-husband, had never been far from her thoughts. She could still hear his voice in her nightmares, sharp and cruel, reminding her of everything she was supposedly incapable of. Leaving him had taken every ounce of strength she could muster, and even after the divorce papers were signed, he never truly let her go. At first, the calls had been subtle, a quick hang-up when she answered, a voicemail with nothing but heavy breathing. Then came the letters. They were carefully written, never directly threatening but filled with enough innuendo to send a chill down her spine. "You know you can't run forever," one of them had read. She had shown John, who reassured her that it was just Rodriguez trying to regain control. But Roner knew better. She could feel his hatred pressing down on her like a storm cloud, even from miles away. The past year had been better, though. The calls stopped. The letters became less frequent. John had convinced her to go back to school, and she'd begun to believe that Rodriguez had finally moved on. But Rodriguez wasn't the type to move on. He had been watching, waiting. From a distance, he observed the small victories Roner was accumulating the nights out with John, the glow of confidence that had returned to her face. To him, these weren't signs of healing. They were an insult, a challenge to his dominance. And Rodriguez wasn't one to lose. That morning, Rodriguez had driven over 2 hours to reach Raleigh. He parked his car in an unremarkable lot off a side street and walked into a hardware store. Surveillance footage from the store would later show him browsing the aisles, pausing to examine tools and supplies. But his purpose was clear. When he reached the counter, he handed over his ID, signed the required forms, and left with a shotgun and a box of shells. He didn't rush. He wasn't panicked. It was as if he had all the time in the world. Back at Roner's house, the afternoon stretched on peacefully. John had stepped out to run errands, promising to be back in time for dinner. Roner poured herself a cup of tea and settled into the living room, her small dog curled up at her feet. She didn't notice the car idling at the end of the street or the figure that sat inside, watching her every move. At 5:22 p.m., the first knock came. It wasn't a polite, casual tap. It was deliberate, firm. She froze, the cup of tea slipping slightly in her hand. Peering through the peephole, she felt her stomach drop. There he was, Rodriguez, standing on her front porch like he belonged there. He didn't look disheveled or angry. That was what made it worse. He looked calm, composed, as if this was just another visit to discuss something mundane. She didn't open the door. She couldn't. Instead, she backed away slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She grabbed her phone and dialed John's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Another knock, this one louder. Roner Rodriguez called out, his voice deceptively casual. "I just want to talk." Roner's hands trembled as she dialed 911. She whispered her address into the phone, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The dispatcher asked her to stay on the line, but she couldn't risk it. She hung up and pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself invisible. Outside, Rodriguez stepped off the porch and began circling the house. She could hear his footsteps on the gravel path beneath her windows. And then silence. By 5:39 p.m., the quiet neighborhood erupted into chaos. Flashes of red and blue lights illuminated the street as the first squad car arrived. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, trying to make sense of the commotion. And inside the house, Roner clutched her dog tightly, praying that she would survive the next few moments. If this story is resonating with you so far, hit that like button and subscribe to stay with us. We're just getting started, and there's so much more to uncover. Don't miss out on the next part of this intense journey. That evening, Rodriguez parked his car a few blocks away from Roner's home. The sun had dipped low on the horizon, casting an orange glow over the quiet streets. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set. To anyone passing by, he might have seemed like just another neighbor. But Rodriguez wasn't there to blend, and he was there to reclaim what he believed was his, no matter the cost. At 7:46 p.m., he stepped out of the car. The soft crunch of gravel under his boots was barely audible. He carried himself with a disturbing calm, the kind that betrayed the chaos bubbling beneath the surface. His figure moved swiftly through the shadows, slipping between streetlights, unnoticed by the families finishing dinner or settling in for the evening. This was a neighborhood where trouble felt like a distant concept, not something that could appear unannounced on a doorstep. Reaching Roner's house, he circled the property once, surveying. The living room window glowed warmly, and he could make out John Rowe's silhouette moving inside. John, oblivious to the predator in the yard, was stacking plates on the dining table, likely setting up for the quiet dinner he'd promised Roner earlier. Rodriguez felt his chest tighten with fury. He chose the back door. It was always the back door. Rodriguez pulled out a small tool from his pocket, a screwdriver, worn and familiar from years of use. In minutes, he jimmied the lock and stepped inside, his movements as silent as the tension now gripping the air. John heard the sound first. A faint creak, like someone shifting their weight in the hallway. At first, he dismissed it, thinking it was Roner. But as he turned, he froze. Standing there, barely a few feet away, was Rodriguez. His face was unreadable, save for the faint twitch in his jaw. Rodriguez didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a taser. Before John could react, Rodriguez lunged forward, the device crackling as it connected with his chest. John fell backward, the plates on the table crashing to the floor. The shock wasn't enough to incapacitate him entirely, but it was enough to send him sprawling, giving Rodriguez the upper hand. The scuffle was messy. John fought back, grabbing the edge of a chair to swing at Rodriguez, who dodged and stumbled into the kitchen counter. Glass shattered and the two men grappled for control. John managed to land a solid punch, sending Rodriguez staggering back. He didn't wait to see the outcome. Rodriguez fled out the back door, disappearing into the night. Less than 15 minutes later, Rodriguez returned, this time with the shotgun. He carried it with a confidence that made it clear he wasn't planning to hesitate. He kicked in the back door, the frame splintering under the force. John, still catching his breath from their earlier encounter, stood his ground in the living room. The sound of the gunshot tore through the house, deafening and final. John fell to the floor, clutching his side, blood staining his shirt. Roner, who had been upstairs folding laundry, heard the commotion and froze. Her body felt like it was moving through water as she raced down the stairs, heart hammering against her ribs. When she reached the living room, the sight of John lying on the floor, his hand pressed against the wound, nearly brought her to her knees. But there was no time to process the horror. Rodriguez was moving through the house now, searching for her. She could hear his footsteps, deliberate and slow, as if savoring the moment. Roner ran. She darted into the garage, fumbling for the door handle, desperate to find a way out. But Rodriguez was quicker. He cornered her there, blocking her path. The shotgun hung loosely in his grip, but his eyes, burning with a mix of rage and twisted satisfaction, were locked on her. "You took everything from me," he hissed, his voice trembling not with fear, but with years of pent-up anger. He stepped closer, raising the weapon slightly, as if to make his point. Roner backed into the wall, her mind racing. But then, inexplicably, he stopped. He stared at her for a moment that felt like an eternity, his expression shifting ever so slightly. There was something unspoken in his hesitation, but Roner didn't wait to figure out what it was. The moment he turned his head, distracted by the faint sound of sirens in the distance, she bolted. She slipped back inside the house, locking the door behind her. Her breaths came in ragged gasps as she crouched beside John, who was still alive but barely conscious. The pool of blood beneath him was growing, and she pressed her hands against the wound, desperate to stop the bleeding. The sirens grew louder. Through the front window she could see flashing lights approaching, their arrival a beacon of hope amidst the nightmare. Officers surrounded the house, their voices booming through megaphones. "Drop your weapon and come out with your hands up." Roner glanced at John, his eyes fluttering open for just a moment. "You have to go," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But she couldn't. She couldn't leave him. The police shouted again, their instructions clear, but Roner stayed frozen, torn between her instincts to protect John and her fear of Rodriguez finding her again. Her hands shook as she looked down at the man who had saved her, wondering if this was the last time she'd see him alive. If you're on the edge of your seat right now, give this video a thumbs up. It helps us know you're enjoying the story and want more of these real-life narratives. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of the drama that's unfolding. The quiet was replaced by chaos. Police cars lined the streets, their lights slicing through the darkened sky. Officers crouched behind vehicles, weapons drawn, shouting instructions through megaphones. Inside the house, Rodriguez stood firm, shotgun in hand. His breathing was erratic, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and desperation. This was no longer about control or even revenge, it was about survival, and he was determined to go down on his own terms. He didn't respond. Instead, he paced the living room like a predator trapped in a shrinking cage. Through the broken window, he caught glimpses of officers taking positions. They were everywhere. For a moment, his grip on the shotgun tightened. He wasn't just cornered, he was outnumbered. But surrender was never an option in his mind. Roner stood behind a barricade, flanked by 2 officers. Her body trembled as she watched the house where everything she'd built was falling apart. She had begged the officers to go in and rescue John, but they told her it wasn't safe yet. The sight of the man who had given her hope lying inside, possibly bleeding out, made every passing second unbearable. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You don't understand, he's hurt. He's inside and he needs help." "We're doing everything we can," one of the officers assured her. But the words felt hollow. Roner clutched her arms, her nails digging into her skin as she tried to steady herself. Inside, Rodriguez made his move. He fired a shot toward the officers outside, the blast tearing through the front window. Shards of glass rained down onto the porch. The officers ducked for cover, shouting for backup. Another shot followed, this one grazing the side of a police vehicle. The air was filled with a sharp, acrid smell that mingled with the tension gripping everyone around. The negotiator's voice returned, more urgent this time. "Rodriguez, stop. You're making this worse. No one else needs to get hurt." But Rodriguez wasn't listening. He moved through the house, his footsteps heavy, his movements erratic. He was losing control not just of the situation but of himself. His gaze landed on a family photo still hanging on the wall, one he hadn't noticed before. Roner and John smiling at some park. The sight made his chest tighten. In his twisted logic, that smile was his to take away. Outside, Officer Max Gillick was repositioning. He was one of the most experienced officers on the force, known for his ability to stay calm in high-pressure situations. He moved quietly along the side of the house, hoping to find a vantage point to assess the interior. As he reached the back corner, he glanced through a crack in the curtains and saw Rodriguez moving toward the kitchen. Suddenly, the curtain shifted. Rodriguez saw the movement and reacted. He raised the shotgun and fired, the blast shattering the glass. Max was hit before he could react, the force knocking him to the ground. His partner yelled for medics, dragging him to safety as blood pooled around him. Roner heard the shot and froze. Her legs felt like they would give out beneath her as she turned toward the officers, her voice trembling. "Who got hit?" Her words came out as barely a whisper, but no one answered her. The focus remained on the house. Inside, Rodriguez was bleeding too. He had taken a hit during the earlier exchange, though adrenaline had dulled the pain. He leaned against the wall, gripping his shoulder, but his rage kept him moving. He fired another shot toward the door, but it hit nothing of importance. The sound reverberated through the neighborhood, sending another wave of panic through onlookers. The officers outside tightened their perimeter. The standoff had reached its breaking point. Rodriguez had no intention of surrendering, and they couldn't risk another casualty. Inside, the shotgun felt heavier in his hands. His breaths were shallow now, his vision blurry. He staggered toward the living room, his mind racing. He thought about Roner, about how she had slipped through his fingers, and about the man who had taken his place. The world felt like it was closing in on him, and he wanted one final act of control. The officers advanced, shields raised, their movements calculated and deliberate. When Rodriguez raised the shotgun one last time, they didn't hesitate. The sound of gunfire echoed through the night, and Rodriguez fell where he stood. For a moment, everything stopped. The shouting, the movement, even the air seemed to hold its breath. Officers approached the house cautiously, their weapons still drawn. When they finally entered, they found Rodriguez lifeless, the shotgun lying beside him. The medics rushed in moments later, their focus shifting to John. Roner watched from the barricade, her heart pounding as she saw them carry him out on a stretcher. His face was pale, his breath shallow, but he was alive. The sight sent a wave of relief through her, but it was fleeting. As the ambulance doors closed, Roner climbed in beside John, her hand gripping his tightly. She couldn't bring herself to look back at the house, at the shattered windows and broken doors that had once been a place of refuge. It was no longer her home. It was just a place where everything fell apart. The gunfire had stopped, and the street began to quiet as the reality of what had just unfolded settled in. Rodriguez's life had ended in the same house where his obsession had begun, but the damage he caused was far from over. Inside an ambulance speeding toward the hospital, John Rowe lay unconscious, his pulse faint, his breath shallow. Roner clung to his hand, silently pleading for a miracle. The ambulance crew worked tirelessly, shouting instructions to one another as they fought to stabilize him. Roner barely registered their words, her focus entirely on John's face, the man who had given her hope, who had stood by her through the darkest moments of her life, was slipping away. She whispered his name, willing him to open his eyes, but he didn't respond. When they arrived at the hospital, doctors and nurses flooded the emergency room. Roner was ushered into a waiting area, her legs unsteady, her thoughts racing. She didn't even notice when an officer sat down beside her, offering quiet words of reassurance. Time lost meaning as she sat there, staring at the floor, replaying the events of the evening in her mind. It was nearly midnight when the doctor emerged. His expression said everything before he even spoke. "I'm so sorry," he said gently. "We did everything we could, but the injuries were too severe." Roner's world crumbled. Her knees buckled, and the officer caught her before she hit the ground. The sound that escaped her lips wasn't a scream, it was something raw, something that came from the deepest part of her grief. She had survived Rodriguez's wrath, but the cost was unimaginable. The man who had promised her safety, who had shown her what love could be, was gone. In the days that followed, the media descended on the quiet neighborhood, turning it into a spectacle. Reporters camped outside, eager for interviews and sound bites. Roner, however, stayed silent. It wasn't until John's funeral, a small and somber gathering, that she finally decided to speak. Sitting in her living room with a local journalist, she recounted the years of fear and torment that had led to this moment. "It started with the little things," she said, her voice steady but filled with pain. "A call here, a letter there. At first I thought I could handle it, but it got worse. He'd show up at my work, at my friends' houses, anywhere he thought he could catch me off guard. I went to the police so many times, but they just told me to get a restraining order." The journalist nodded, encouraging her to continue. Roner's hands trembled as she picked up a court document from the coffee table. "He had a record," she said, her tone growing sharper. "A long one. Stalking convictions, violations of restraining orders, you name it. But every time it was the same story, a slap on the wrist, a few months of probation, and then he was free to start again. She held up another piece of paper, this one detailing the removal of Rodriguez's ankle monitor just months before the incident. They said he was low risk, she said bitterly. Low risk. And now John is dead because of it. It started with the little things, she said, her voice steady but filled with pain. A call here, a letter there. At first I thought I could handle it, but it got worse. He'd show up at my work, at my friends' houses, anywhere he thought he could catch me off guard. I went to the police so many times, but they just told me to get a restraining order. The journalist nodded, encouraging her to continue. Roner's hands trembled as she picked up a court document from the coffee table. He had a record, she said, her tone growing sharper. A long one. Stalking convictions, violations of restraining orders, you name it. But every time it was the same story, a slap on the wrist, a few months of probation, and then he was free to start again. She held up another piece of paper, this one detailing the removal of Rodriguez's ankle monitor just months before the incident. They said he was low risk, she said bitterly. Low risk. And now John is dead because of it. Court records revealed a troubling pattern. Rodriguez had been arrested multiple times for harassment and stalking, but the sentences were always suspended. Despite clear evidence of escalating behavior, he was never incarcerated for more than a few weeks. The decision to remove his ankle bracelet, despite numerous violations, was just one of many systemic failures that left Roner vulnerable. The story gained traction, sparking a broader conversation about the justice system's shortcomings. Experts weighed in on television and in print, highlighting how restraining orders and probation were often inadequate in protecting victims of domestic violence. One advocate explained, "The system isn't built to deal with someone like Rodriguez. It treats stalking as a nuisance, not a legitimate threat, and that puts people like Roner in danger." Roner, still grieving, agreed to speak at a public forum about domestic violence a month after the incident. Standing at the podium, she looked out at the crowd, her hands gripping the edges of the microphone stand. "I'm not blaming the police," she began, her voice trembling but resolute. "They did their job that night. But the system failed me. It failed John. And it will keep failing unless we demand change." She paused, taking a deep breath. Rodriguez didn't start out with a shotgun. He started with a phone call, a voicemail, a letter. Every time he crossed a line, he got a little bolder because no one stopped him. By the time he walked into that hardware store to buy the gun, it was already too late. The crowd was silent as her words hung in the air. "I don't want sympathy," she continued. "I want accountability. I want a system that actually protects people before it gets to this point. Because if it doesn't, there will be more Rodriguez's and more people like John who don't get to come home." The forum sparked widespread calls for reform. Advocates pushed for stricter penalties for stalking, better enforcement of restraining orders, and more comprehensive mental health evaluations for offenders. But for Roner, no amount of change could bring back the man she loved. At home, she sat in the quiet, staring at the empty chair where John used to read his paper every morning. The house felt hollow now, a shell of what it once was. But even in her grief, she found a sliver of strength. She began writing letters to lawmakers, sharing her story in the hopes that it would lead to real change. "This isn't just about me," she said in one interview. "It's about every person who's ever felt trapped, who's ever been told to just wait it out or file some paperwork. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." The road ahead was long, but Roner was determined. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could fight to make sure John's death wasn't in vain. And for the first time in weeks, she felt something she thought she'd lost forever, a glimmer of hope. The months after the tragedy were a blur for Roner. Days bled into nights, and time lost its meaning. Her home, once a sanctuary, now carried the heavy weight of what had happened. Every corner of the house seemed to whisper a memory of John, his favorite chair by the window, the coffee cup he left on the counter, the way he laughed when he read the morning paper. But now those memories felt more like wounds than comforts. Roner had to find a way to keep going, not just for herself but for her children, who had become her reason to get out of bed each morning. They had lost so much already. She couldn't let them lose her too. Her days began to center around them helping with homework, sitting beside them at the dinner table, trying to make life feel normal, even if it wasn't. The simplest moments, like hearing their laughter as they played in the yard, became small lifelines. But nights were harder. Alone in the quiet, she found herself replaying every moment of that night. The sound of gunfire, John's pale face on the stretcher, the finality of the doctor's words. It was impossible not to wonder if there had been anything she could have done differently. The guilt clawed at her, even though she knew deep down that she wasn't to blame. The community stepped up in ways she hadn't expected. Neighbors brought meals, offered to drive her kids to school, and left handwritten notes of encouragement in her mailbox. John's patients sent letters filled with gratitude, recounting stories of how he had cared for them. One woman wrote, "He was the only doctor who listened to me when no one else would. I wouldn't be here without him." Those letters reminded Rona of who John was: kind, selfless, and steadfast in his care for others. As the weeks turned into months, Rona realized she couldn't let John's death be just another tragedy in the news. It had to mean something. She began to channel her grief into advocacy, starting with small steps. She reached out to a local domestic violence shelter, sharing her story during support group meetings. At first, speaking about her experience felt unbearable, but as she spoke, she saw the impact her words had on others. Women who had felt powerless began to share their own stories. For the first time, she felt like she was doing something that mattered. It wasn't long before her advocacy grew beyond those small meetings. She started speaking at fundraisers and public events, her voice gaining strength with each appearance. She didn't shy away from the hard truths. "The system failed me," she told one audience. "I begged for help. I went to the police. I filed the restraining orders. But at every turn I was met with excuses. Rodriguez violated those orders over and over and nothing was done. A piece of paper didn't save me. And it didn't save John." Her speeches caught the attention of lawmakers, who invited her to testify at hearings about domestic violence legislation. With every opportunity, she pushed for stronger penalties for repeat offenders, mandatory GPS tracking for those with restraining orders, and better resources for survivors. One by one, small victories began to emerge. A bill requiring stricter monitoring of high-risk offenders was signed into law, and funding for domestic violence shelters increased. Despite the progress, the work was exhausting. Rona balanced her advocacy with her role as a mother, trying to ensure her children didn't feel forgotten amid her growing public presence. On a sunny spring afternoon, she gathered them in the backyard with a small sapling in hand. It was a red oak, chosen for its symbolism, strength, resilience, and endurance. As they worked together to plant the tree, her youngest son asked, "Why this tree, Mom?" She knelt beside him, her hands covered in dirt. "Because this tree will grow strong, just like us. It'll stand tall for years to come, and whenever we see it, we'll remember John and everything he taught us about love and kindness." Her daughter added a small plaque at the base of the tree, engraved with John's favorite saying, "Love is the only legacy that lasts." The sight of it brought tears to Rona's eyes, but they weren't just tears of sadness. They carried something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "I can't change what happened. I can't bring John back, but I can fight to make sure no one else has to experience what we did." If you're out there feeling trapped or unseen, please know there are people who care. You don't have to face this alone. There is help, and there is hope. If you've been moved by this journey of healing, please like this video to show your support and share the message. Subscribe so you don't miss any future stories that can inspire change and bring hope to those who need it most.